They assumed you were simple to figure out. Let that settle for a moment. Not because you lacked awareness, not because you were desperate, but because you were open, you were kind, you engaged, you cared. And in a world where emotional distance has become the default, your presence looked like weakness. Your consistency looked like attachment. Your patience looked like dependence. They observed you quickly, the way avoidant people often do, measuring risk, calculating control, evaluating how much influence they could keep without losing their sense of independence, and what they decided felt straightforward. This one won't leave. This one will stay. This one is safe to test. But what they failed to understand while they were busy analyzing was something deeper. Strength doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it listens, sometimes it waits, sometimes it loves deeply without losing its center, and often the quietest people are the ones who surprise everyone when they finally decide they've had enough. They thought you were easy to play. They misjudged you, and the moment they recognized that, everything between you began to shift. Avoidant individuals don't usually enter connections thinking they want to hurt someone. That idea is too shallow. What truly drives them is the need to feel in control. Control equals safety. Emotional distance equals safety. If they can predict your reactions, if they can pull away and trust you'll chase, if they can go silent and expect you'll double text, they feel steady, regulated, secure in their autonomy. So when they met you and noticed how understanding you were, how you didn't react strongly to small inconsistencies, how you searched for the good in them even when things felt unclear, they registered that as an opening. Not consciously manipulative, but instinctively strategic. They test without always realizing they are testing. They delay responses to see if you get anxious. They cancel plans to see if you accept it. They hold back affection to see if you compensate. Every reaction you give becomes information. And early on, you responded with patience. You responded with grace. You responded with reassurance. And to them, that translated into something risky, leverage. They believed they had the upper hand because you seemed emotionally invested. They assumed you would bend before you would ever break. What they didn't account for was that patience has limits, and self-awareness changes everything. The reality is, your empathy became the very thing they misunderstood. You didn't overlook their behavior because you were weak. You understood it because you were perceptive. You sensed their fears before they even expressed them. You noticed how closeness made them slightly uneasy, how vulnerability caused them to shift the topic, how compliments made them deflect. And instead of reacting with frustration, you responded with gentleness. You thought maybe they just needed safety. Maybe consistency would show them that not everyone leaves. So you reassured them. You gave space when they pulled away. You tried to meet them halfway, even when they barely moved forward. But here's the part they didn't anticipate. Empathy does not erase self-respect. Compassion does not eliminate boundaries forever. And people who love deeply are often the same people who detach cleanly when they realize their depth is being taken for granted. They mistook your willingness to understand for a willingness to tolerate everything. That was their miscalculation. Because understanding someone's wounds doesn't mean you're willing to become one yourself. At first, the illusion of control felt real to them. When they went quiet, you reached out. When they seemed distant, you asked what was wrong. When they gave you breadcrumbs, you tried to make something meaningful out of them. That dynamic fed their sense of control. They didn't have to fully commit because you were still there. They didn't have to clarify intentions because you remained hopeful. Hot and cold behavior works best when the other person is emotionally reactive. And for a while, you were. Not because you lacked dignity, but because you cared. Caring makes you try. It makes you communicate. It makes you seek clarity. Every time you leaned in, they leaned back just enough to maintain space without fully losing you. That push and pull created a rhythm where they always felt slightly ahead, slightly less invested, slightly more in control. But here's what they didn't expect. Patterns only work until someone recognizes them, and once you saw the pattern, you stopped moving to it. The shift didn't happen loudly. There was no dramatic confrontation, no explosive ending. It was quiet, internal. You grew tired, not necessarily of them, but of feeling like you were the only one carrying emotional weight. You began to notice how much energy you spent analyzing mixed signals, how often you replayed conversations trying to interpret meaning, how frequently you minimized your own needs just to maintain peace. And something within you shifted. You realized that loving someone shouldn't feel like performing for stability. You realized that clarity isn't too much to ask for. You realized that chasing consistency from someone who thrives on distance only exhausts you. And so, you did something they never saw coming. You regulated yourself. You stopped over-explaining. You stopped sending long messages when they sent short ones. You matched energy, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. That's when confusion entered their space. The version of you they had labeled as predictable suddenly became unreadable. Silence from you felt different than silence from them. When they pulled away, it was calculated distance. When you stepped back, it was emotional recalibration. They were used to controlling the pace. Now they couldn't read you. You weren't asking for reassurance. You weren't seeking attention. You weren't reacting to delays. The control they thought they had began slipping quietly away. That loss of predictability is unsettling for someone who depends on control to feel secure. They started checking their phone more often, wondering why you hadn't followed up. They noticed the absence of your emotional effort. The dynamic had flipped, not because you were trying to win, but because you were no longer willing to lose yourself. You didn't become cold. You simply redirected your warmth back toward yourself. You invested in your own routines, your own growth, your own peace. You detached with dignity, and dignity carries power. They underestimated you because most people don't shift like that. Most people cling when faced with distance. Most people escalate when they feel disconnection. But you chose differently. You grounded yourself. You stopped negotiating your standards internally. You understood that if someone truly values you, they won't need constant reminders of your worth. And if they don't value you, overextending yourself won't create it. That realization alone elevated you. It made your presence rare, because now it was no longer guaranteed. And nothing unsettles someone who relies on emotional control more than losing guaranteed access. They thought you were easy to play because you loved openly. But open love combined with self-respect is not weakness. It is rare strength, and rare strength is never easy to manipulate. What makes this even more powerful is that your shift wasn't driven by revenge. You didn't wake up trying to make them anxious. You woke up realizing you deserved reciprocity. That shift in energy is subtle but powerful. When your mindset moves from, "How do I keep them?" to, "Does this align with me?" everything changes. Your tone changes. Your patience changes. Your availability changes. And the person who once felt in control begins to feel uncertainty, not because you're playing games, but because you stopped participating in theirs. They thought they understood you. They believed they had your emotional pattern mapped out. They assumed your attachment meant permanence. But they overlooked one essential truth. People who can attach deeply can also detach decisively when respect fades. And somewhere in the quiet space after you pulled back, they felt it. Maybe not immediately. Avoidant personalities often process emotions later, but absence has a way of creating clarity. Your silence wasn't loud, so it couldn't be dismissed as drama. It was calm, intentional, grounded. And grounded behavior is difficult to challenge. The more stable you became, the less reactive you appeared. And the less reactive you appeared, the less control they felt. That's when their initial assumptions started to unravel. Maybe you weren't easy. Maybe you were patient. Maybe you weren't clingy. Maybe you were committed. Maybe you weren't desperate. Maybe you were simply hopeful. And hope, when withdrawn, creates an emptiness they didn't expect to feel. What matters most is this: being underestimated is not a flaw. Sometimes it's the quiet beginning of something powerful. They saw softness and assumed fragility, but softness rooted in awareness becomes strength when needed. You didn't change who you are. You change what you allow. Your empathy still exists. Your depth still exists. Your ability to love hasn't disappeared. What changed is your willingness to offer it without equal effort. And that's what surprised them the most, because now the same person they thought would always be there is no longer waiting in the same way. The dynamic that once favored their comfort now begins to demand their effort, and effort feels unfamiliar for someone who built safety around distance. So when you reflect on this situation, don't shrink yourself back into the story they once created about you. You were never easy to play. You were generous with your heart. You were consistent. You were emotionally aware in a space where avoidance felt normal. They simply misinterpreted your kindness as compliance. And once you corrected that misunderstanding, not through words but through actions, the entire balance of power shifted. That isn't manipulation. That's growth. That's what happens when someone recognizes their value and stops offering it freely in spaces where it isn't appreciated, and whether they admit it or not, that realization changed how they perceive you. Because nothing is more humbling than discovering the person you thought was easy to keep is fully capable of walking away with quiet grace. And this is only the beginning of that shift. It truly is the beginning, because once silence stops being reactive and becomes intentional, everything transforms. What they didn't grasp at first was that your quiet wasn't weakness collapsing inward. It was strength gathering itself. You weren't pulling back to punish them. You weren't mapping out some kind of revenge narrative. You were recalibrating your nervous system. You were stepping out of survival mode. For so long, you had been emotionally stretching to meet inconsistency, bending to accommodate unpredictability, adjusting your tone so you wouldn't trigger distance. And the moment you stopped doing that, something powerful shifted inside you. You felt steady. You felt clear. You felt aligned with yourself again. Silence, for you, became self-respect in motion. And that's what they misunderstood entirely. They assumed your quiet meant you were waiting for them to return. They didn't realize your quiet meant you were finally okay without it. The reason they underestimated that silence is because they've used silence differently their entire lives. For them, silence has often been a shield, a tactic, a way to reclaim control. When closeness feels overwhelming, they disappear to regulate. They pull back to breathe. They withhold emotion to avoid feeling engulfed. So when you stopped reaching out, they instinctively assumed you were playing the same pattern. They thought you would break soon. They believed your absence was temporary, that you were just testing them the way they had tested you. But what they didn't anticipate was your consistency in that distance. You didn't send small check-ins. You didn't leave emotional traces. You didn't create dramatic moments to pull them back in. You simply remained grounded. And grounded silence feels very different from strategic withdrawal. One is manipulation. The other is maturity. And maturity is unsettling to someone who relies on control. As time passed, something began shifting within them as well. It didn't look dramatic on the outside. Avoidant personalities rarely display emotional turbulence openly, but internally a quiet disruption began forming. You were supposed to chase. You were supposed to overthink. You were supposed to seek clarity from them. And yet, here you were, composed, moving forward, no longer orbiting around their inconsistency. That disruption hit deeper than they expected, Because when someone who seemed invested suddenly becomes steady without you, it forces reflection. It raises questions. Was I overestimating my importance? Did I misunderstand their boundaries? Did I push too far? The control they once felt started dissolving into uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable when you've built emotional safety around predictability. Here's the part that matters most for you to recognize. Emotional regulation is powerful. When you stopped reacting impulsively, you interrupted a cycle. No more long messages trying to fix miscommunication. No more seeking reassurance. No more emotional explanations hoping to unlock vulnerability. You chose calm. You chose observation over reaction. And that kind of steadiness is magnetic. It creates space for the other person to feel the weight of their own behavior. When you're no longer absorbing all the emotional tension, it doesn't disappear. It shifts back to where it began, and suddenly they're the one sitting with discomfort. They're the one wondering. They're the one checking your activity. They're the one replaying conversations. You didn't create their anxiety. You simply stopped buffering it. When control begins to slip, suppressed attachment starts to surface. Avoidant individuals often believe they're less affected than they truly are. They convince themselves they can detach easily. They take pride in their independence. But attachment doesn't vanish just because it's minimized. It lingers quietly. It stays dormant until something threatens its access, and your emotional withdrawal threatened that access. The routine of you being available, responsive, understanding, that routine mattered more than they admitted. When it disappeared, so did their sense of stability, and that's when subtle anxiety begins to rise. Not loud or dramatic, but quiet internal shifts, wondering if you've moved on, wondering if someone else is now receiving the warmth they once overlooked, wondering if they miscalculated entirely. This is often the stage where reappearance starts forming, not always from deep self-awareness. Sometimes it's curiosity, sometimes it's ego, sometimes it's the fear of losing access completely, but something pulls at them. They might begin watching your stories again, liking posts after weeks of silence, sending a casual message as if nothing ever changed. A simple, "Hey, how have you been?" On the surface it seems neutral, but underneath that simplicity is a subtle question. Are you still available? Are you still open? Do I still have influence here? What they won't openly admit is that your composure unsettled them. Because if you had reacted emotionally, they could have labeled you as reactive and justified their distance. But your steadiness removed that narrative entirely. You might feel tempted at this stage to interpret their return as validation, and in some ways it does confirm something important. You were never as easy to play as they once believed. But this is where your growth deepens. Their reappearance is not automatically proof of change. Sometimes it's simply a response to losing control. The difference now is that you are no longer operating from fear of abandonment. You are operating from clarity. You can observe behavior without being pulled into it. You can listen without immediately lowering your boundaries. That is evolution. Before, you may have rushed back, relieved by their attention. Now, you pause. You evaluate consistency. You notice effort. You don't over-invest based on minimal signals. That shift keeps the balance intact. What's happening internally for them during this phase is layered. There is conflict. A part of them values connection. A part of them misses your presence. A part of them recognizes that your calm distance reflects strength. But another part resists stepping fully forward. Because stepping forward requires vulnerability. It requires accountability. It requires risking dependency. And dependency is their deepest discomfort. So they hover. They test. They send small signals instead of clear intentions, and they watch closely. The irony is, they once believed you were predictable. Now they're trying to understand your new energy. And unpredictability in someone who used to be consistent draws attention. You became unpredictable not because your personality changed, but because you stopped overexposing your emotional availability. You stopped explaining every feeling. You stopped seeking reassurance from someone who struggled to give it. And in doing so, you reclaimed a sense of mystery. Mystery isn't about playing games. It's about boundaries. When someone doesn't have constant access to your inner world, they begin to value the moments they do. Before, they could rely on your emotional openness. Now access must be earned through consistency. That isn't manipulation. That's emotional maturity, and maturity forces either growth or retreat. Something else begins to form as well. Respect. Quiet, reluctant respect. When you didn't beg, when you didn't break down, when you didn't retaliate, when you simply recalibrated and moved forward, it challenged everything they assumed about you. They thought you were emotionally dependent, but your independence showed itself with ease. They thought you were overly attached, but your detachment proved balanced. They thought you would chase, but instead you walked away with dignity, and dignity leaves an impression. It isn't loud, it doesn't demand attention, but it stays in someone's mind. It makes them reconsider how they defined you. It shifts perception in ways they didn't expect. Now, here's the difficult truth within all of this. Not every avoidant individual will grow because of your silence. Some will retreat further. Some will protect their ego by convincing themselves they never cared. Some will move on quickly just to avoid self-reflection. And that's okay, because this was never about forcing someone else to evolve. This has always been about you evolving first. Your strength was never dependent on their realization. Their realization is simply a side effect of your boundaries. The real victory is internal. It's the moment you stop measuring your worth through their consistency. It's the moment you understand that being easy to love does not mean being easy to manipulate. And if they do try to step back into your life, you can now recognize the difference between someone protecting themselves and someone playing you. Protection honors boundaries. Playing disregards them. Protection expresses fear honestly, while playing creates confusion with intention, and your growth allows you to sense that distinction almost immediately. You're no longer operating from hope alone. You're moving with awareness. That awareness steadies you. It makes you more selective. It makes you emotionally strong in a quiet, grounded way. So as this chapter continues to unfold, hold on to something important. The shift that unsettled them wasn't an act. It was alignment. You aligned your behavior with your self-worth. You aligned your availability with mutual effort. You aligned your silence with peace instead of punishment. And that alignment reshaped the entire dynamic. They thought you were easy to play because you loved openly. But now they see that open love supported by boundaries is unshakable. Whether they rise to meet that standard or retreat from it, you remain steady. Because the truth is, you were never easy. You were simply genuine. And genuine people often seem easy to those who don't understand depth. That truth repeats itself in different ways because it matters. You were never easy. You were real. And realness only looks simple to those who live on the surface. This is where the psychological reversal truly begins to take form. At first, they believed they were navigating you. Now, they're navigating themselves. They once observed your reactions to measure control. Now they observe their own reactions to your absence. And that shift feels uncomfortable in ways they didn't expect. Because when you stop overextending, when you stop proving, when you stop carrying emotional labor for them, a mirror appears in front of them. And mirrors are confronting. Suddenly, the uncertainty they once stirred in you begins echoing inside their own thoughts. They start wondering what you're thinking. They begin questioning whether they misjudged the situation. They notice your energy feels different, less accessible, more grounded, almost untouchable in a quiet sense. And that subtle untouchability changes everything about the emotional environment. Before, they could rely on your reassurance. If they stepped back, you leaned in. If they delayed affection, you gave more. If they doubted the connection, you defended it. Now that pattern is gone. Now when they hesitate, you remain composed. When they test, you don't chase. When they offer minimal effort, you don't expand it into meaning. That's the reversal. The same ambiguity that once kept you awake now lingers in their mind. The same curiosity that once had you checking your phone now nudges them to check theirs. And here's the powerful truth. You didn't design this shift. You didn't study tactics. You didn't play a role. You simply stopped abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable. And that alone changed everything. What makes this even deeper is the respect that begins forming beneath the surface. It may not be spoken. It may not arrive with dramatic confessions, but it exists. When someone realizes they misjudged your strength, their perception changes. They once saw your emotional openness as convenient. Now they see openness paired with boundaries. And that combination demands recognition. Boundaries bring clarity. They signal that access to you depends on mutual effort. And when you maintain boundaries calmly, without anger, without revenge, it reshapes how they see you. You're no longer the person who waits endlessly. You're the person who chooses carefully. And choice carries weight. But there's a truth here you need to hold firmly. Not everyone who respects you will step up to meet you. Some people admire strength from a distance because stepping into it requires growth. It requires vulnerability. It requires accountability. And accountability feels heavy for someone who built their emotional patterns around avoidance. So, while they may respect your composure, they may still struggle to match it. That's not a reflection of your value. That reflects their internal limits. Growth is uncomfortable. It challenges familiar coping patterns. It exposes emotional habits that once felt safe. And not everyone is ready to let go of what protected them, even when it now restricts connection. You may begin noticing subtle changes in them during this phase. They become more observant. They pay closer attention to your tone. They analyze your responses. They try to understand whether your distance is permanent or temporary. And within that observation, there is vulnerability, because the person who once relied on detachment is now feeling uncertainty. Uncertainty humbles. It removes assumptions. It forces reflection. They may not say it aloud, but internally something shifts from, "I can control this," to, "I might lose this." And losing something you assumed would always be there feels different. It disrupts ego. It exposes attachment that was previously minimized. This is also the stage where you need to stay grounded, because when someone who once seemed distant begins leaning closer, it can awaken old hope. It can stir the version of you that still desires consistency from them. And there's nothing wrong with that feeling. It's human. But now you have awareness. Now you can distinguish between genuine effort and reactive behavior. Genuine effort is steady. It's accountable. It shows someone meeting you halfway without being pushed. Reactive behavior looks intense but lacks depth. It appears as temporary attention driven by fear of losing you. And your growth allows you to feel that difference without confusion. There's also a deeper emotional layer forming inside them, one that often remains unspoken. When you stepped back calmly, it forced them to face a truth they had avoided. They were not as detached as they believed. Your absence revealed feelings they had minimized. And that realization creates conflict. Now they must choose. Do they continue maintaining distance and risk losing you entirely? Or do they move toward vulnerability and risk feeling exposed? For someone who associates vulnerability with discomfort, that choice isn't easy. It challenges their identity. It asks them to rewrite patterns that have shaped their relationships for years. And rewriting those patterns requires courage. Meanwhile, Your internal world has shifted in ways they may never fully grasp. You've experienced peace without chasing. You felt clarity without needing constant reassurance. You've proven to yourself that your stability doesn't depend on their behavior. That realization is powerful. It's transformative. Once you experience that level of self-trust, it becomes difficult to return to old patterns, because you know what it feels like to be grounded. You know what it feels like to preserve your emotional energy instead of pouring it into uncertainty, and that self-trust becomes your anchor. At this point, something else becomes clear. The real difference between playing someone and protecting yourself lies in intention. Playing seeks control. Protection seeks balance. When they withdrew earlier, it was often to regain control. When you stepped back, it was to regain balance, and balance is sustainable. Control eventually collapses. You didn't create confusion, you stepped away from it. You didn't manipulate perception, you clarified your standards. That distinction matters deeply because it preserves your integrity. You can look at yourself and know you didn't become cold, you became intentional. As the dynamic continues evolving, the emotional mirror effect grows stronger. The uncertainty you once carried becomes their internal dialogue. The curiosity you once felt becomes their quiet questioning. The doubt you once held now flickers in their awareness, not because you placed it there, but because you stopped absorbing it. Energy tends to return to its source when it's no longer intercepted, and when that happens, growth becomes inevitable for at least one person in the connection. You. The most important realization in all of this is that the real victory was never their reaction. It was your transformation. It was the moment you decided your depth deserved reciprocity. It was the moment you stopped minimizing your needs to fit someone else's comfort. It was the moment you understood that being loving does not require being endlessly available. That shift is internal, it's quiet, it doesn't need validation, and it remains regardless of whether they return changed or stay distant. If they do try to re-enter more fully, you now hold discernment. You can listen without giving up your standards. You can observe consistency over time instead of reacting to momentary intensity. You can allow connection while still maintaining boundaries. And that balance is maturity. It's not about closing your heart, it's about protecting it wisely. And if they cannot meet you at that level, you now have the strength to walk away without losing yourself. That is the real change. That is the real power. And the deeper truth settling into this chapter is simple. You were never easy to play because your love was never shallow. Depth unsettles those who skim the surface. Consistency challenges those who rely on unpredictability. Boundaries disrupt those who grew comfortable with control. They misunderstood you because they evaluated you through the lens of their own limitations. But now they begin to see something different. They see someone who can love deeply and still detach with clarity. Someone who can offer warmth without sacrificing self-respect. Someone who no longer asks for clarity because they embody it naturally. So as this journey moves toward its final stages, hold this understanding close. You didn't lose power when you stopped chasing. You uncovered it. You didn't become distant when you went quiet. You became centered. You didn't prove them wrong through retaliation. You proved them wrong through growth. And growth is the most undeniable statement you can make. They believed you were easy to play, but what they encountered instead was someone who learned, adjusted, and elevated. That kind of evolution cannot be controlled. They thought you were easy to play, yet what they faced was someone who evolved beyond the role they assigned, and that kind of transformation cannot be manipulated. Now we move into the final layer of this story, the layer that is no longer about them. It's about you fully understanding what truly happened. Because the biggest shift in this entire dynamic isn't that they started feeling uncertain, it's that you stopped meeting them there. There was a time when their delayed reply could change your mood, when a small sign of attention could brighten your entire day, when silence felt like rejection instead of reflection. But now, things feel different. You no longer spiral the same way. You no longer interpret everything through fear. And that emotional independence is the real transformation. Here's what many people don't acknowledge. When you stop chasing someone who is used to being chased, you disrupt more than a pattern. You disrupt their identity within the connection. They were used to being slightly ahead, slightly less invested, slightly harder to read. That position gave them psychological leverage. It protected them from vulnerability. But once you balanced the energy, once you stopped overextending, the dynamic leveled out. And leveling a connection feels threatening to someone who associates distance with strength, because now they can't rely on imbalance to feel secure. Now they have to show up equally or risk losing the connection entirely. The irony is, you didn't become colder, you became clearer. Clarity is not harshness. Clarity is knowing what you will accept and what you won't. Clarity is recognizing when your effort outweighs theirs. Clarity is understanding that love without reciprocity slowly erodes self-worth. And once you saw that truth, you couldn't ignore it anymore. That awareness shifted your presence. It changed your tone. It changed how quickly you responded. It changed how much emotional energy you gave without return. And those small shifts created a ripple effect they couldn't overlook. At some point, they likely felt that emotional mirror fully. The uncertainty they once caused you began reflecting back toward them. They started wondering where they stood. They questioned whether they still had access. They noticed that your life continued without hesitation. And that realization can feel heavy for someone who assumed their presence was central to your emotional stability. Because when someone realizes they are wanted but not needed, it changes everything. Being needed feels powerful. Being wanted feels earned. And earning connection requires effort. But here's the part that completes your transformation. Your goal was never to make them anxious. It was to make yourself peaceful. And peace is quiet. It doesn't seek validation. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists. You stopped overthinking whether they would message. You stopped creating imagined conversations in your mind. You stopped measuring your worth through their consistency. And in that stillness, you rediscovered something you had temporarily lost: your center. That internal grounding is more powerful than any strategy. It signals emotional independence. It communicates that you value connection, but you don't collapse without it. And that energy carries weight. Now, not every avoidant person will respond with growth. Some will withdraw further because your boundaries challenge their comfort. Some will convince themselves they didn't care to avoid vulnerability. Some will move toward easier connections where they can maintain control without resistance. And that's okay, because your growth was never dependent on their reaction. The purpose of this shift was to restore your self-respect, not to guarantee their return. And when you truly understand that, you stop viewing outcomes as success or failure. You begin to see them as alignment or misalignment. There is a significant difference between being chosen and being valued. Being chosen can happen out of convenience, loneliness, or familiarity. Being valued requires someone to recognize your depth. Early on, they may have chosen you because you felt safe, because you were consistent, because you were emotionally available. But now, if they choose you, it must come with respect. It must come with effort. It must come with the understanding that your presence is no longer unconditional without reciprocity. That shift raises your standard completely. The real victory in this story isn't that they realized you weren't easy to play. It's that you realized you were never meant to be easily accessible without equal investment.